Chapter 26 of Betty Baird's Golden Year by Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 26 The Gypsies. "I can't stand it," said Betty to herself, half aloud. She sprang up from the chair by the window where she had been sitting since coming home from the church. Her mother, Lois, and Mrs. Lane were talking quietly in the next room, and overseeing Aunt Harriet, the old family nurse, who was packing Lois's trunks. Betty tiptoed across the hall, past the billiard room where the men were trying to while away the remainder of the afternoon with desultory games, down the low steps, and ran to the open door. There she found Edwina, with Minerva and the owl lying in her relaxed arms, dozing elegantly, though unmistakably, in the wicker chair Lois had brought down from the attic. It had been Lois's own little chair, and now Lois was to be married to-morrow. Betty stooped over and kissed Edwina gently. "Poor little thing, she is taking her afternoon nap," she thought. "Edwina," she whispered. Edwina was wide awake in a second. "What is it, Cousin Betty?" she asked, putting her arms lovingly around Betty's neck and drawing her face down to kiss her. She was never too sleepy or too tired or too elegant to brighten into her own sweet natural little self when Cousin Betty came near. "Don't speak loud, for I want to steal away without any one knowing, and I want you to go with me." "May I take Minerva? She'd be lonely in this strange place." "Yes, do. We'll get the pony and drive and drive and drive." "Why, Cousin Betty!" exclaimed Edwina wonderingly. She thought she detected a sob in Betty's voice. "Hush! Come this way." With the help of a little darky, they hitched up the pony to the low-swung basket phaeton, and were soon traveling leisurely through the tree-arched roads and over the gentle hills and picturesque stone bridges of the Baird estate. Silently they drove along, Betty thinking, in spite of herself, of the separation coming the next day, though there was a prescience of happiness in the very air, joy in the songs of the birds, and fragrance everywhere. Now and then Edwina looked at her cousin, but she understood that she wished to be silent, so she could only admire the yellow roses in her belt and touch them lightly to draw Betty's attention. "I've come out to be miserable, Edwina," Betty said all at once, brushing away a tear, but smiling too. "I came out to complain and to give myself up to unmitigated unhappiness." "You've known Lois a great many years, haven't you, Cousin Betty?" asked Edwina in a consolatory voice, trying to carry on the flagging conversation. "Oh, not more than 5 centuries, Edwina dear," smiled Betty. "I was so happy when she came to the Pines that day to be my roommate. I gave her half the hooks in the closet, but she had so many dresses that she needed more, and I gave her more, as I didn't need all of my half, but she made me feel rich with my made-over dress. I knew better, but I pretended with her, and we were perfectly happy. But it's all over now." Edwina began to cry. "What in the world are you crying for, Edwina? Lois isn't going to die." "But you cried, Cousin Betty," said Edwina defensively. "Yes, but that's different. I'm growing maudlin with age," she laughed. "I'll soon take to snuff, like old Aunt Harriet. Now we'll go home by a beautiful little stream." She turned the pony and began to sing: jog on, the footpath way, and merrily hent the stile a. A merry heart goes all the day, your sad tires in a mile a. They passed a low embankment covered with violet petunias, white candytuft, and dwarf sunflowers, which enclosed a deserted house. "That's a quaint, ramshackle place," said Betty, examining it with interest. As she turned forward again, she was startled to find a gypsy encampment by the brook. 4 or 5 white tents stood in the glen, and a bevy of laughing, quarreling children played by the stream. Their mothers, dressed in black, but with yellow or pigeon blood red aprons and neckerchiefs, were preparing supper over little open fires on the greensward. Back of the tents were several large wagons, and beyond, in the open meadow, a number of well-conditioned horses roamed at will and cropped the sweet grass. Betty's first impulse was to turn and fly. She had childish memories of gypsies stealing children, and she instinctively took Edwina in one arm. The road, however, was too narrow to turn there, and she had to go on. A facetious saying of her father's flashed into her mind, that it was best to propitiate the evil spirits, because the good ones wouldn't hurt you. She determined to test its truth. She bowed pleasantly to the gypsies and was driving by when a buxom young woman came up to them. "Have your fortune told, lady?" she asked. "No, thank you, not today," Betty answered, driving on. The girl, however, was by the side of the phaeton, looking at her with merry black eyes. Her black hair was plaited down her back and ornamented with a high amber comb, and big gold hoops hung from her ears. In spite of her barbaric dress and the cunning expression of her eyes, there was something almost noble in her presence. She laughed easily and heartily, apparently from the exuberance of healthy spirits, showing her strong white teeth. Her sun-browned cheeks grew red, and altogether she presented a splendid picture. Several small children, shy but good-natured, clung to her dress, and from their stronghold eyed the strangers boldly. "Come, let me cross your palm with silver," the gypsy said cajolingly. "If I must," sighed Betty, smiling and handing down a 25-cent piece. "I see two young men," the gypsy began in a sing-song voice. "One is dark and one is fair. Both love me and one is jealous," finished Betty, amused at the stereotyped prophecy. She had really expected more originality from this handsome creature. The prophetess threw a mischievous smile at Betty, then grew sternly solemn. "I see but one man. He stands alone. He is tall, handsome, neither dark nor fair. He loves you. He has a grand home." "Why not a castle?" interrupted Betty, knowing the gypsy love of foretelling untold material grandeur. "It might just as well be a castle, and would be more romantic." "It is a castle," the gypsy maid assured her. "That's a grand home, surely." "Good!" Betty turned to Edwina. "It's the Baird castle." "There's no use in my trying if you don't believe in my second sight," said the girl, offended by Betty's unconcealed incredulity, or at least professing to be. "Now, how could I believe in it?" asked Betty, yet smiling in a friendly way. "I see a castle. I see it," reasserted the girl stubbornly. "So do I," said Betty, laughing. "Thank you for your good wishes. Now we must go. Here are some pennies for the children," and she scattered a handful on the road and laughed to see them scramble for them. As Betty leaned over to give one to a wee tot who had not been able to compete with his big hardy elders, Mr. Minturn on horseback came dashing around the bend in the road. He pulled up his horse suddenly. Tall, straight, with a face not easily forgotten because of its strength and high breeding, proud yet not vain, though bearing unconsciously in his carriage the ancestral marks of those who had been proud of their place in the world and of their power and influence, he was a man of notable distinction. In the pony phaeton sat Betty, winsome and merry, dressed in white, her golden brown head close to the blue-black mane of the young gypsy, as she bent over to give out her pennies. Edwina, awestruck, her doll hugged to her breast, clinging to Betty, the tall, commanding figure of the young gypsy woman, with her blood-red shawl, great hoop earrings, orange petticoat, and general barbaric splendor, the gypsy encampment, the old woman in strange attire holding rollicking children, on the banks of the stream two old men fishing, over all the warm balmy air, the sound of the brook, and the leafy archway of trees throwing shadows on the yellow road. "Why, Mr. Minturn!" exclaimed Betty, looking up suddenly from her gift-making. Her face grew bright with welcome. Then she tried to hide its warmth by a studied indifference. The gypsy gazed intently at the man, then back at Betty. A smile crept into her dark eyes. "Arcadia!" Minturn cried, vaulting off his horse. Betty caught the significant expression in the gypsy's eyes, and her teasing yet good-natured smile. "It's time to go home," she said, a little formally. She nodded coolly to the gypsy, but laughed as the babies, tumbling on the soft grass, waved frantic farewells with their chubby hands. She threw them kisses and more pennies as she turned away, but kept her eyes determinedly from meeting those of the gypsy maid. As Betty and Edwina drove up to the portico, with Minturn riding beside them on the thoroughbred, they found Jack standing alone by one of the pillars, smoking his companionable pipe. He gave them a quick, searching glance. He saw that something out of the ordinary had happened. He could see that Betty was greatly disturbed, though he could not discern that she was both disturbed and frightened by Minturn's look, the hint in the gypsy's eyes, and at her own warmth of welcome. She felt that the world had had a new twist since she started out to forget the one Lois's coming marriage had given it. "The world's all right, Betty," said Jack, as she passed him with a troubled countenance, scarcely returning his cheery greeting. "I didn't expect that from you, Jack Brooks," she replied, much to his mystification. They were much alike in temperament, and had been true comrades, too well satisfied with the present to anticipate the future unnecessarily. It was the time for a hearty friendship, and both had a gift amounting to talent for loyal true friendships that nothing could change and nothing weaken. While this was a bond between them, it was at the same time a stumbling block to the hopes the friends of both had for them. With unusual keenness Jack had penetrated Minturn's secret. He was not surprised. Naturally, everyone would love Betty. As for jealousy, well, Jack was not in the least a dog in the manger. Besides, he felt he could well afford to be generous, as he knew, or thought he knew, that Betty's mind and heart were not concerned in the slightest with love and marriage. He believed that his good comrade Betty was, like himself, happy in the gay present, satisfied and contented with conditions as they were. However, he knew that Minturn was a man of purpose, of quick and determined action, a man who had accomplished much for his years, and who would not dally long in his wooing. Then, perhaps for the first time in his happy carefree 21 years, Jack felt his heart grow heavy. No one had ever meant as much to him as Betty, and now Betty— He emptied his pipe, pounding it meditatively against the palm of his left hand, and stalked frowningly into the house to dress for dinner, and incidentally to have a look at that man Minturn. Lois and Betty had planned to devote a part of this last evening to minstrelsy. Since their early childhood, when the Order of the Cup was founded, they had lost none of their love for the old troubadours and the songs of the knightly era. Tonight they would have the songs of the South, led by some of the ancient retainers of the Baird family. A splendid feature of the house was a curving balcony, with beautiful balustrade, which connected the two stairways on the level of the second floor. This the girls had named the Minstrel Gallery, and here Lois had called together the musicians of the plantation, who, in honor of the occasion, had achieved something not unlike the motley or harlequin costumes of old. There was white-haired Pompey, with his beloved guitar, who never failed to tell visitors that he had been one of Washington's body servants, though he invariably forgot to tell them that he was but 80 years of age. Julius Caesar, his frivolous son of nearly 60, with his yellow fiddle plentifully covered with rosin dust, and George Washington Jackson, the patriarch of them all, with his tinkling banjo. Swaying back and forth as though in ecstasy, and keeping time by thunderous beats of their huge feet, the picturesque trio led the company in song. Lois and Dunny stood a moment alone in the shadowy hall, and tears came to Lois's eyes as she thought of those days gone forever, when her mother, whom she could not remember, and her father had lived and loved in this very home. "Lois!" pleaded Dunny. "It's the past, Dunny. It seems to flit back with the candlelight and the rhythm of the music. My mother—" But Lois could not continue. "I know, sweetheart," comforted Dunny, "but I'll try to make a happy present and future for you, though I—" "Oh, Dunny, I'm happy, happy, happy!" Before Dunny could answer with more than a pressure of the hand, Jack and Minturn came down the stairs together. They didn't seem to have much to say to each other. Looking around, Lois saw Mrs. Baird coming down the other stairway, alone. "Why, where's Betty?" Lois exclaimed, going forward to meet her. "Edwina's determined to be resplendent tonight, and Betty is helping her to dress. It seems to be difficult to suit her fastidious taste." There was a rustle and the sound of quick steps, and they all turned to see Betty, clasping Edwina by the hand, coming down the stairway, holding up the train of her filmy white gown. Edwina fluttered by her side in pink. Minturn was at the foot of the steps in an instant, holding out a hand to Edwina, and jumping her down the last 2 steps, and asking Betty for the first waltz. Jack caught Dunny's eye, and the 2 friends walked away and talked for a moment on the portico, while Betty and Minturn joined Mrs. Baird and Lois. "He's in dead earnest," commented Jack. "And Betty?" "Who knows? If it isn't you, Jack, I hope it will be Minturn. He's a man all through, and I'm afraid, old fellow, if I can judge from what Lois said, that it will be Minturn." "Well, Dunny, you know she and I have been the best of friends in the world, but without any sentimentality. Yet it will go kind of hard." End of chapter 26. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 27 of Betty Baird's Golden Year by Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 27. Lois's Wedding. In carriages, on foot through the shady paths, and on horseback, even in the pillion fashion of old, came the guests from the surrounding country to Lois's wedding. The little ancient cruciform church peeped out through its mantle of dark English ivy at the golden sunlit world. Its silent interior was dim and cool, yet glowed here and there with bits of color from the rich stained glass, the golden cross and candlesticks, and the richly embroidered altar cloth. The sacristan, an old family friend, had seen to it that the venerable church had been swept and dusted until scarcely a mote swam in the rays of sunshine that filtered into the chancel. And no hand but his had been allowed to arrange the flowers on the gradine and to bank the fragrant white roses and palms at the sides of the altar. As the guests entered, they stepped on a marble floor that might well have reminded them of the lines from George Herbert. "Mark you the floor? That square and speckled stone which looks so firm and strong is Patience, and the other, black and grave, wherewith each one is checkered all along, Humility." While they were being seated, the vested choir, led by a boy soprano with a voice of thrilling beauty, sang "Oh, for the Wings of a Dove." Lois, leaning on her father's arm, passed down the garlanded aisle and met Dunmore before the altar. As she stood there at his side, before the venerable clergyman who had baptized her and instructed her for confirmation, her veil of tulle and old lace falling over her simple yet rich satin gown, it seemed to Betty that there never could have been a more beautiful bride. On the return from the church, Lois and Dunmore alighted from their carriage at the entrance gateway and walked up the shadowed road between the lines of children whom Lois had known from their infancy. They sang their songs of love and good wishes, and strewed the path of the bride with fresh wild flowers and roses, symbolically thornless, to the rambling old house that had looked down the long avenue at many a brilliant wedding party, walking up to its welcoming doors. Yes, it had looked down that avenue for more than 2 centuries. And now came Lois Baird, and of all the brides the old house had smiled upon, none had been fairer or more beloved. The wedding breakfast passed all too quickly, and before the guests were aware of anything unusual — Betty protested that it was magic — Mr. and Mrs. Lane had disappeared. There were great hurryings to and fro, and gay searching parties, but all of no avail. The bride and groom had stolen away on their wedding journey, leaving the rice and the old shoes and all the well wishes on the hands of the gay tricksters. Betty and Minturn stood by the fountain, watching the doves dip into its water, then whisk out, shaking from their iridescent necks and snowy wings the tiny drops that splashed merrily back again. After Lois's departure, Betty had hurried to this pleasant spot to be alone, and Minturn, walking through the many interwinding paths, had been led there by a glimpse of Betty's white gown as she ran down the steps to the flower garden. They did not talk much, but musingly watched the dainty birds, turning easily from them to speak of the fragrance of the jessamine near by, of the perfect day with its cloudless sky, of the bride and bridegroom and the church, of the doves fluttering in mid-air, whose wings seemed to Betty's fancy like the petals of the water lilies that swam in the pool. "By the way, Miss Betty, your Scottish castle is to be sold," Minturn remarked, with an airy ease and a spontaneity that his eyes somehow belied. "Oh!" cried Betty impulsively, straightening up with a movement of surprise. "Then my poor eagles will be wanderers again." "It's too bad," deplored Minturn. "Bad," repeated Betty. "Isn't there something we can do to prevent those eagles being driven from their immemorial crags?" Minturn was silent. "How did you learn that it was to be sold?" persisted Betty, determined to stick to the safe subject of the eagles. "I received a letter from a friend who lives not far from there. He said the castle was about to be offered for sale by the present owner. I wrote to him for more information, and a day or 2 ago I received this." Minturn handed her an agent's list of estates for sale. Betty took the pamphlet gaily. "There is the castle, and there are the crags." "Let me see those immemorial crags," he demanded laughingly. He glanced at the picture as Betty held it out to him, but his eyes wandered from it to her bright, winsome face. "Wouldn't you think they'd have some eagles flying around?" she queried, studying the view intently, perhaps too intently to be altogether convincing. "Maybe they don't feel at liberty to throw in the eagles, since they belong only to the Bairds," he suggested, smiling. "Those poor eagles! After a fidelity of 5 centuries," she quoted from the wordy legend, "to be turned out into a cold and unfriendly world at a moment's notice. I wonder where they will go." "Perhaps they'll come to America." "I suppose we couldn't call on the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals to take this in hand, could we?" she suggested. Minturn made no reply. As they had seemed apart from the rest of the world when riding back to the manor on the night of the fire, so it was now, in this summer's day, in this old Southern garden. The day was warm and still, the air heavy with the sweet odors of flowers, the mazarine blue sky above them, the sun scarcely breaking through the trellised roses and jessamines that formed a screen at the back of the marble seat, where they two sat alone by the fountain. "I must talk about the eagles," Betty found herself thinking. She feared she had said it aloud. "Now surely," she began, with heightened color, her eyes fastened on the picture as if her life depended on it, "you should be able — I mean — oh, why don't you — Now here is this castle, beloved by the eagles and rightfully theirs, and no one is willing to lift a finger to save it for them." Betty glanced up, then turned again to the picture, while the color fled from her face. Minturn bent close to her. "There's a way to save the eagles, Betty." Her head went lower, while her cheeks crimsoned from his look, his words, and the intensity of his low tone. Minturn clasped the picture and the hand that held it in both of his. "Betty, Cousin Betty, it's time to get ready for the train, Aunt Helen says," broke in Edwyna's voice. "Why, Cousin Betty, what makes you so red?" Without replying, Betty sprang to her feet and made her way to the house at a pace that compelled Edwyna to trot and even Minturn to lengthen his long strides. "Were you cross at Mr. Minturn, Cousin Betty?" whispered Edwyna as they hurried along, but Betty only shook her head. A week or so later, as Betty was tucking Edwyna into bed, she leaned over and kissed her good night. Then she kissed her again, and once more began the tucking in of the bedclothes, though there was not a loophole left to close. Evidently Betty had something on her mind, something to tell little Edwyna, which she found hard to say. Kneeling by the bedside and burying her cheek in the pillow, she answered that unanswered question of Edwyna's, which the child had propounded by the fountain in Maryland, by asking another. "Edwyna, would you like to have a new cousin?" The little arms flew from the carefully tucked in covers. "Cousin Betty!" She pulled Betty's head down close, asking, in a delighted whisper, "Cousin Laurence?" Betty sprang up, laughing and blushing furiously. "Gracious, Edwyna, you're a witch! How did you guess?" "Yes," she added as she hurried towards the door, "it was Cousin Laurence at first sight." End of chapter 27. Recording by Holly Jensen. End of Betty Baird's Golden Year by Anna Hamlin Weikel.